Next level. Next level.
Welcome and thanks for joining us. This is the City of Aspen City Council work session for May 23rd, 2022. Tonight on our agenda, one item, moratorium project update, residential building regulatory framework. And I just wanted to say this is a pretty lengthy and possibly dense meeting and conversation this evening. We are going to try to get through this as expeditiously as we can, realizing that we would like to not be here any later than 7 p.m. this evening. But it does look like a full item, so with no further ado, I turn it over for introductions.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council. For the record, Ben Anderson, Planner with Community Development. Sitting at the table with me, Garrett Larimer, Planner with Community Development, Philip Spino, Community Development Director, and to my right, Jessica Garrow from Design Workshop, our lead consultant, and I work on the residential building part of the moratorium. If it's okay, I'd like to share my screen.
Please do.
Let's see here. It's going to let me do that.
There it goes.
There we go. Okay. So we're getting to the later stages of what's been a long process, I think, both for council staff and the community. We've had several conversations with you during the process in work sessions as we've moved through our evaluation of the situations surrounding moratorium. We've worked with our consultant teams to kind of hone in on topics, and certainly the feedback that we received during our public engagement with the community has been very instructive. And similarly to what we did, what Philip and Haley did with the short-term rental process, we wanted to come to you in a work session, have one last conversation with you ahead of coming to you in first reading with a draft ordinance. And the memo in tonight's discussion is framed to try to facilitate a conversation on some where we are in terms of our policy formulation at this point. We have, as we're identified in the memo, a few outstanding policy questions that we'd like some feedback from you on and some direction on as we start to finalize the draft code language. And I think also just to give counsel, as you folks have continued to think about these issues and talk to people in the community, if there's additional questions or additional direction, or ahead of first reading, if there's any additional information that you would like us to be presenting, and then that, kind of acquiring and aggregating in the next couple of weeks before we come to you with draft ordinances. It's really the point of the conversation this evening. This is a timeline that we've been kind of updating along the way, and this has been amended to accommodate the 2-month extension and our drafting process. Tomorrow evening, you're going to be hearing first reading on short-term rentals. We've got a meeting on the residential building topic on June 7th with Planning and Zoning Commission. We're going to be back to you on the residential building topic at first reading on June 14th. And then both ordinances to you at second reading proposed for the last regular meeting in June on the 28th. (3/22) was the date of the policy resolution that City Council passed, both on the short-term rental topic and on the residential building topic. Since that time, staff and the community and City Council have done some considerable work on this. Staff has been working on code drafting, been having lots of conversations with other city departments, continued one-on-one discussions with technical stakeholders, consultant support both from Design Workshop and our other consultant team. Certainly we've been working on finalizing the employee generation study, doing case studies and analysis, doing code review, and then Design Workshop and City Explained were essential in continuing to drive our public engagement efforts. We had the late April focus groups and a pedestrian mall event. We've continued to put materials and ask questions on Aspen Community Voice. So there's been a lot of stuff happening in the last couple months, and I think we're getting to a point where we have things to sort of present and to kind of finalize some last minute questions that we have as we come to you in the next couple of weeks with draft ordinances. Next steps in our process, we do have some important things to talk about tonight and some important direction that we're asking for council to provide. Staff and our consultant team are in the kind of the stage of finalizing our code drafting, getting the ordinances ready for your consideration. That includes making sure that what we're proposing gets vetted both internally and externally. And the code language, once we have it finalized, there's a couple topics that we're still sort of landing on. Folks that have participated in our engagement process to this point will certainly have a chance to look at our code. We've got, legal sufficiency experts looking at our code. So before you see the draft ordinance at second reading, there's going to have a lot of people who have had eyes on our draft code language. And then again, and this is just a reiteration, future meetings with P&Z and future meetings with City Council on these topics as well. I'm going to let Jessica explain a little bit of the work that they did related to the exhibits that were attached to the end of the work session memo, and then she'll hand things back over to me. So.
Great. Thank you, Ben. So Design Workshop has spent the last few months going through and doing some basically existing conditions analysis, as well as a little bit of forecasting of if the city were to adopt certain different policies, what that might mean in terms of affordable housing creation. So the memos that are included in your packet, the first is a community case study analysis, and that was done way back in January and February, and really helped, I think, ground some of our thinking and work with staff as it related to potential code changes. So it runs the gamut, everything from administrative processes, which I think are not going to be touched as part of the moratorium, but may be important information as some next steps, to how some other communities deal with affordable housing mitigation, generation, as well as the definition of demolition. So all of those topics, things that will be discussed tonight. And that's just a good way to ground information and a process. The other three reports that are included in your packet are really looking at what is happening right now within the city related to residential building impacts on the landfill. What are some of the trends in the real estate market? I think you can see from the data there's been an increase in the amount of demolition debris that is going to the landfill. There has been an increase in the number of transactions since 2019 as it relates to real estate sales, and the price of those real estate sales has increased quite significantly. We also took that information and looked at what would it mean if the city were to rethink maybe a buy-down program. Again, I think our conclusion was that's a large policy conversation, probably happens after the moratorium, but depending on the direction that the city goes as it relates to housing mitigation requirements, that could form the basis for potentially a buy-down program within the community. And then finally, we did an analysis of our residential zone districts, so R6, R15, and R30, and what would the feasibility be for developing multifamily affordable housing on those zoned properties. We used some case studies to understand kind of what did that mean. And I think from a from a policy perspective, some of the changes are really kind of helping set the groundwork to enable the more development of affordable housing. But I think you see from the analysis right now, the way that real estate prices are, it's not necessarily feasible for a developer on their own, even if you increase density allowed to 3 or 4 units on these lots, that they would just do it outright based off of just the zoning change. But it does set that framework for potential future policy adjustments in the future. We don't want to get into too many of those details tonight, but happy to answer any questions as we're going through the material. And I'll turn it back to Ben to go through some of the policy conversations.
And just to kind of emphasize these points at the bottom of the page, I do think, some of this work was done very early on. Some of it's been more recently kind of arrived for staff's contemplation, but I think all of it's been really helpful to, I think, staff kind of frame these issues, understanding the constraints that are elsewhere and certainly as they apply to Aspen. But I think really these things are helpful for us to think about, some of the opportunities that are going to be available to us, following the passage of these particular ordinances and some of the other work that we might do, particularly around affordable housing development.
Yeah, Skippy's got a question.
I just had a quick question.
Yeah.
Jessica, you're saying you don't want to get into those details tonight, but I do have a lot of questions about those
Great. We're
details,
happy
and
to.
so I'm just wondering, from staff's perspective, what is the appropriate time and place to ask those questions, to be able to share all that, and the rest of it then?
This is the venue for that,
Okay.
absolutely. We just didn't want to guess where council wanted to go on any of those particular topics.
Okay.
The experts are here to answer any and all questions that you have.
Okay.
And given sort of where we are on that process timeline, now's the time to shed light on all this stuff, discuss it, understand the sort of interrelationships between what staff's proposing and what our studies have found, and make sure that we're moving in the right direction for council. So this is that conversation.
Great, and I'll do my best to keep those questions concise and focused.
And I, just to kind of follow up on what Philip just said, for each of these topics, I mean, we've got I think 6.
It's a lot.
Well, I think we have 6, questions that we are wanting to get some specific direction from council on. But I do think that we certainly are encouraging and expecting, questions on all of this stuff as we go forward. So please feel free to interrupt when it seems the right time. So the memo, I think, was broken up into two sections. The heart of it was about these kind of 4 primary policy proposals that I think are the guts of the work that we've done and the responses that we've identified towards council directions and towards our from our public engagement efforts. Demolition redevelopment really is focused on the growth management quota system chapter, the creation of the new allotment system. Affordable housing mitigation touches both GMQS and, because of the relationship to floor area, calculations and measures. Affordable housing review process is really in GMQS, and we had to lightly touch the affordable housing credits chapter. And then lastly, the additional opportunity for affordable housing was really located in the zone district standards. And as much as both in the memo and in the presentation this evening, I've identified the code sections that we're going to be touching. But just know that, it certainly wasn't there in the memo. We'll have draft code language for you at first reading. But I think this is a fairly comprehensive coverage of, where we're going at say a 3,000-foot sort of policy scale as opposed to 30,000 feet. Okay, demolition. I think from staff's view, in response to council discussion and the goal statements within the moratorium efforts, I think this response in GMQS around development allotments is probably the place where I think staff feels we have responded to the concerns around pace and scale of development. And the big idea here is to use our GMQS allotment system that's been around in one way or another since the late 1970s, using particularly the residential allotments, which currently sit at 19, and to assign a portion of those towards this development process of demolition and redevelopment of single-family duplex homes, and to include that into the larger allotment system related specifically to residential allotment. And so within the GMQS system, we have, allotments for lodge development and commercial development. And right now, this type of development activity, which I think from staff's view and our consultant's view, is really the thing that's driving a lot of the, I think, community sentiment around pace and scale of development is in this type of redevelopment process. There is, within GMQS, there's a review process for each of those when an allotment is issued. And those things primarily in the past have been either at the P&Z level or at the council level in terms of issuing an allotment. After lots of conversation with the design and development community, I think that when you get an allotment, there are some discretionary criteria that are present for the issuance of some of those allotments. But they're, right now, different from what it was in the past, the standards for getting one of those allotments are fairly minimal. And the idea here is to, one, acknowledge the impacts of this type of development, demolition or redevelopment, and assign, not only kind of constrain the number of those things, but if you are going to get one of those things, to have those projects meet performance standards. We'll talk a little bit about what that means in just a second. But when we talked to the development community, they were very comfortable with setting those standards high, but they wanted to be very objective, and they wanted the process to be very predictable. Mm-hmm. And so as a consequence of that, staff is recommending that the GMQS process to get a development allotment is going to be administrative, and it's going to be based on very objective standards. In the past, going fairly far back into the GMQS system, there was a competition system, and it went to P&Z, and looking at the minutes from those meetings, oftentimes the path that projects went through was not consistent, was not predictable, was not something that I think if you were going to be investing in a project you could rely on. And so combining that feedback with what we heard from the development community in 2022, we're recommending that these allotments be issued administratively. They're based on objective standards. And, staff thinks that what we're setting out for these projects are going to translate into a fundamentally different, residential product in the city of Aspen moving forward, or at least the start of that.
So, question. Help me understand, so we kind of talked about that competition-based system, and I understand everything you're saying about making it objective, which I think is great. But help me understand as an applicant, say we go with 5, just for the sake of clarity here, and there are 10 people that apply in that year. How does that happen? Is it still a scoring, ranking type of matrix? How are they chosen? Like, walk me through that as an applicant.
It's a first come, first serve, which is the way that it currently is in the code. Because of what we're requiring from these projects, or proposing to require from these projects, it is a land use application, administrative as it's proposed. But because of what we're requiring, it's not like you can submit a vague project for consideration for the land use piece and then come back with a fundamentally redesigned project for a building permit. And so the idea here is that more so than other land use processes right now and the relationship to the building permit process, that application is going to come in for the allotment is going to come in relative proximity to when a project's ready to submit for building permit.
Sure.
Now, this first year, this is going to be an experiment, and I think we're all going to have to sort of acknowledge, I think, process and outcomes and all that kind of stuff of what we're shooting for, because it's new. And I think that first, that relationship between the land use process and the building permit process is going to require projects to be further down along the design stage than they typically are when they come in for a land use process. If somebody was coming in for a stream margin review or something, sometimes that happens months or years before a building permit's actually submitted. Because of the nature of what we're going to be asking for, land use and building permit are closer together. So I think that once in a year that number of allocated allotments is reached, I think there's a couple of paths. One is that we're done for the year. The second is that in the land use code for all allotment types, there's what we call a multi-year allotment process, where they can come to council and ask for the assignment of next year, an allotment from next year. And I think we're imagining that, particularly in this first year, when we're landing on the right number of allotments and all that kind of stuff, that there's probably going to be some requests for those.
Sure.
But there is a path. There is at that point, it's a discretionary choice. It's a discretionary review from City Council. Is where that request for a multi-year allotment goes after the number that we land on is used in a particular year.
Okay, and so it will, what I'm hearing is it will not be that your project gets some type of score for the degree to which you reach a objective desired outcome of ours. It's just either you meet it or you don't. There's a minimum barrier you have to clear, and if you're the first in line, you get that allotment as a result. That's correct? Okay. So then I guess the follow-up question is, what's the value of that individual applicant coming to council rather than simply waitlisting, for instance? So that whoever applied first is the first in line for the next tranche, if you will.
I think it depends on at what point in the year, they're wanting to get their project through. I mean, I think if we're through our development allotments 6 months into the year, and there's another, 6-month waiting period until the next, till the next calendar year opens up and the allotments are associated with it. I think there's a 6 months is 6 months.
So coming to us, they could fast forward that 6 months with our approval.
That's correct.
I understand. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I did not
No, that's
understand
okay.
that
That
piece.
hasn't clear.
That makes sense to me.
Just to sort of game out the system over a number of years. If the number's 5 and we allocate 5 and 2 people come in that same year and ask for a multi-year allotment, so we get to 7, The next year's number, as proposed currently, would be 3. And we allocate 3, and 2 people come in and ask for a multi-year allotment, we could get to 5, but then you're at 3 the following year. And what we're accomplishing by having that meaningful number in place is what the section is intended to do, which is put a governor on the pace and the sort of pace of that particular type of development activity.
Is there any concern on staff's perspective that having a yes, no, rather than that sort of more ranking type thing will, I mean, everyone's got to meet the standard and that's great, but will discourage people from trying to outperform the standards that are our own goals around whatever it is, whether it's environmental things or otherwise?
I think that once you get to the multi-year allotment request in front of city council, at that point, a request
Sort of doing that anyways informally.
would probably be adding to the things that they're offering within their project.
Yeah.
To try to convince you fine folks that it's a good idea to grant them additional allotment.
Okay, thank you.
So they're not really granting an additional allotment, they're just queuing it.
That's correct. And
next
taking
year.
it potentially from the next year.
Rachel?
Thank you for that. I had a couple of questions along those lines too, and I don't mean to jump ahead of your presentation if that was coming. But could someone apply for a demolition permit simply just to clear a lot and have it available for resale as a vacant lot, as opposed to having their development plans in place?
We currently don't see that very often.
Yeah.
It has happened occasionally.
No, and it's okay. I
And I
just was
think-
wondering if we were counting on that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and I think it's a great question. We've been thinking about it a little bit, and I will just say that it happens so infrequently, it hasn't been the focus of our work, but I do think it's a scenario that we need to contemplate. I think the way that we probably would find a way, and I have to say probably because it's a topic that we haven't landed on a solution to yet. Probably find a way to allow the issuance of that development or the demolition permit, and have a condition of that be that, a future project on that lot has to go through this process.
Yeah.
You know,
Okay. No, I was just wondering because usually when the houses are lived in, even if they're going on the market, and to demolish while it's being used, on the bet that maybe someone will buy it and develop it in the next few years would seem a little counterproductive. But I just kind of want to raise that one. And then the other thing, of course, which we all know, is that no matter what the number is, with vesting as 3 years, there's always the potential, which we've seen in the past for other circumstances, that people just hold the vesting in their back pocket for 2.5 years until interest rates or the market's better or something, and then they exercise it. So you still could have not just 5 developing in a year, but you could have close to 15, if 5 was the number, from people holding on and waiting to develop when they thought the conditions were right.
yeah, and I think just to talk more about that aggregation of these things, I think, for a fairly typical redevelopment project in Aspen, it's a 3-year process probably.
Yeah.
And so if we're doing, some number between 5 and 8, multiplied by 3, I mean, the community's, experiencing the sum total of those 3 years at any given time in projects that are at different stages of construction.
Right. Okay. I just kind of wanted to point that one aspect out, that it does pace it to some extent, but it can't pace it entirely.
Yeah, and just on the topic of vesting, I think Colorado, this intersects because it's a land use case. It's certainly a site-specific development approval. It then intersects with Colorado state law around the kind of required 3-year vesting period.
Okay. Thank you.
And just to tease out that point, just to make sure I understand it and also for the public, that, potential for 15 or 25 projects going on at once exists in concurrency with, there may be other residential development projects that don't trigger demolition going on. And those could still be significant enough that there's a fence or a heavy piece of equipment and, you could have multiple on one block.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, this is for those, specifically for the projects that trigger 40% demo.
Yeah.
you can do a very significant remodel of your home,
Yeah.
staying underneath that 40%. And, you know, I would say pretty directly that that's one of the intentions
Right.
of this policy is to try to encourage projects to stay underneath that 40% threshold. So they'd still be significant projects, but there's, you know, less material going to landfill. Hopefully the fence isn't up as long, et cetera.
Yeah, I just, to draw that out, because 8 sounds like a small number, but in reality, from what the impact and experience is as a person living in a neighborhood, it's not small.
And, go ahead.
I was just going to go back to the conversation we had last summer about growth management, where we showed a map of the currently permitted projects within the city limits. It's not staff's view that this proposal would change that map in any significant way, right? We're talking about a very small number of projects that would be impacted by these regulations, but that small number are the most impactful types of projects that we see.
We'd see similar quantity, but hopefully less scale of impact or intensity. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, just for clarification, vested rights extends normally for 3 years. And once a building permit has been issued, then people can drag their feet for years as long as they're making some significant progress on the project.
The standard is 6 months of activity on a permit at any one time keeps the permit active.
Yeah.
And so, yes, building permits, once you're out of the planning and land use process and into the building permit process, there are certainly different sort of timing standards that are associated with being in that queue.
So a project could take substantially longer than 3 years to complete.
Correct.
Central to this policy proposal is going to be a document that we are currently naming the Residential Demolition and Redevelopment Standards. And this is a document that's going to be adopted, you know, in a proposed ordinance. But it's going to live outside the land use code. And the reason why it's going to live outside the land use code is that this is the start of a framework for how the city of Aspen is going to be responding to these types of projects over time and the expectations that we're putting on them. And right now, the areas, and I gave a fair amount of discussion on each of these topics in the memo, but right now those standards are identified as waste diversion. This would be participation in the Green Halo tracking system that Pickens County is engaged in, and requiring a minimum amount of diversion, primarily at this point, as we understand it, concrete and metal as the primary things that can easily be diverted from construction waste. On embodied carbon, this is a topic that I think we're all interested in, and yet it's a pretty new topic. I think for the development community to contemplate, some communities have gone a little bit further down, the path on this topic. But right now, we're going to be asking projects to report because we're interested in getting data on those projects. We're not going to be setting a threshold on embodied carbon. Okay. We're going to be setting a threshold on embodied carbon, or excuse me, we're not going to be setting a threshold on embodied carbon. It's simply a reporting and kind of data collection exercise at this point. We want to kind of experiment with different tools that are out there that track embodied carbon for a particular project. We're not at a point yet where we can set a threshold for expectations around this topic yet. Energy reporting. We will expect these projects to participate in an eventual building IQ kind of benchmarking process for residential projects. The next two pieces are really big, though. You may know, because we've talked to you, and I think that you've been asked some questions about this process by our building department folks, but they are in the process of updating their building and energy codes right now. The processes are this process and their process kind of running parallel to each other. They're a few months behind us. And, I think they're moving, we're currently operating on the 2015 building code. And they're wanting to take Aspen on this next code adoption to some fairly progressive places around building energy performance, around the requirements for getting ready for electrification, for getting ready for requirements for photovoltaic and battery backup systems and those kinds of things. The idea here is that they've identified the most important of those improvements that we're going to have apply to these projects initially. Once they get their code adoptions up and running, those codes will be generally applicable, but certainly applicable to these projects. And so we're a little bit trying to deal with their adoption process and not wanting to get in the way of their adoption process, because they're going to be proposing some really interesting things. But we also want to make sure that these particular projects that are going to be kind of these first projects that are going through this process are also subject to those things. So we're creating a relationship between those things and this redevelopment set of standards, redevelopment standards to try to capture the projects that are going to be coming online until they get their full updates to the building and energy codes. And then lastly, the engineering department within their urban runoff management standards has a set of principles, best practice principles for managing stormwater. And they're asking these projects to meet a higher standard of stormwater treatment and using some of those best practices as requirements for these projects that are getting one of these development allotments. Any questions about that? This is some fairly specific stuff that we're talking about generally here, but we can get into the weeds on these things. Yes, sir.
My question has to do with energy reporting, because I know all of us are aware that larger houses take more energy to build, from the blankets used to heat the concrete while it's curing to ground heaters. So I just want to make sure that the energy reporting is robust and maybe even include how much water is used during construction, how many miles the workers drive to and from the job site, et cetera.
And the hope is that several of the tools around the embodied carbon topic get into those topics. And, I think that the industry is experimenting with the tools that are out there, as, what's best and, what's going to be the industry standard for these kind of reporting processes. And I think a lot of many of those concepts are captured by some of those embodied carbon reporting. And it's one of, it's I think staff's desire to start getting data from these projects, because to be honest with you, we don't know those things right now.
Right.
Kind of straightforward question here, but embodied carbon is really just talking about the new construction as opposed to the demolition. Is that?
I think it's just the new construction.
Pretty much, okay,
Just the new
because
construction.
at that point, they're already there. Okay.
Embodied carbon includes from soup to nuts, from when the materials are created until they're deconstructed.
Yeah, no, I was just kind of wondering, though, were we measuring the embodied carbon of something that's deconstructed, or we're just measuring the embodied carbon of the new building?
Of the new.
Of the new. Not what they're deconstructing, but they are still required to do waste diversion of the deconstruction, but not try to measure what was in the concrete from the old construction.
Yeah, it seems to me the waste diversion is really the only part that has to do with the demolition, that all the rest are redevelopment.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Okay. I was just kind of wondering. I want to make sure I was clear. And one other question. Sure. You said we're operating under the 2015 building code. Isn't the international building code updated every 2 or 3 years? Is there a reason Aspen has gone 7 years without updating the building code?
It is updated on 2-year cycles, and communities usually go on 5 to even 10-year cycles between adoptions.
Okay.
And typically the city of Aspen adopts amendments to those codes that are progressive enough and sort of industry leading enough that we're often ahead of at least an adoption cycle. And so this sort of 5 to 7 year interval has been pretty standard for the city over the years, and sort of not something that's out of the ordinary.
Okay, thank you for explaining that we have been trying to update in the meantime with amendments.
Beginner question. Ward gave a good definition, but I want to make sure I understand it. Can you define embodied carbon for me?
So embodied carbon is the total carbon footprint of the materials and the construction of the structure. So from the ore extraction to make the steel, making the steel, shipping the steel from China, trucking it from California, that entire carbon footprint gets captured, which is part of what makes the existing structure embodied carbon such a challenge to report, because so much of it has to do with material sourcing. And so we can tell there's a 2x4 there, but we don't necessarily know where that 2x4 came from.
Right.
And so that's part of the challenge there. But this is all, I mean, embodied carbon is kind of, it's very new in the energy performance, building performance world. And so that's kind of why we're considering just the new construction, and
Great.
that's how it's calculated.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Other question, so this applies to demolition. It also applies to some of these other categories. But just a recognition that, there is a trade-off to some degree, right? We're getting a lot for our community, for our environment, but part of what we're doing is adding additional cost to development, which of course gets passed on in the real estate price and increases the thing that, at least in one area, affordable housing, we are also trying to combat. And so there's competing interests. That's part of this. We have talked before about this vanishing subsection of our free market that is still naturally occurring, whether that's in a trailer park or it's a small studio. And so just being mindful of not accidentally making our last naturally affordable non-affordable by these rules. Can you speak to sort of the perceived increase in cost that this may deliver per square footage? And though, at least for the affordable housing mitigation stuff, that's mitigated because if you're living there, you're good. If you sold to the next person who wanted to be a local, that price is still there. So can you kind of just talk through that a little bit?
I think on the waste diversion piece, I think what we're starting with is not so different from what Pickens County has implemented right now. We're identifying a slightly higher threshold for diversion than what they currently have. And so I do think that there's going to be some additional costs with that, and sort of meeting those requirements and having a construction management plan that allows you to sort of do that kind of separation of materials, or to transport those specific materials separately for processing. The embodied carbon reporting, I think there's a variety of tools out there. We're going to give people some choice about which tool they use. Again, this is new, and we want to see what works best and where we get good information from. There's going to be a cost associated with that. The energy reporting, I think this is going to be following the construction of the house. By the time that this gets set up and we have projects that are at that point, our Building IQ program is going to be much more robustly established, and we'll have mechanisms for people to participate in that. The building energy and performance and electrification, these are things that are becoming standard in the development community already. I think a lot of projects, as we talk to the development community, projects are already pursuing these things because people are desiring these, R values in their wall structures of a certain level, or efficiencies in their mechanical equipment already. But there's going to be a cost associated with that. I will say that I would remind council that these are specific to single family and duplex homes. These are not multifamily homes, and I do think that the nature of development in Aspen right now is of a level that I do think that these costs are going to be marginal.
And to sort of add on to that, and to think a little bit longer term, working with the climate action team and looking at the emissions reduction targets that council's adopted for 2030 and for 2050, we have not had this policy conversation yet as a community, but I feel very confident saying that at some point, the community is going to have a conversation with itself about how we achieve those emissions reduction targets with our existing affordable housing building stock. Because 63% by 2030 is not happening without meaningful reductions in the residential building sector in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Affordable housing is if not a majority of housing units, a significant proportion of the housing units in our community. And so in that way, there's going to be cost associated with meeting those reduction targets, and that cost will be put on, to some extent, affordable housing. And so we're going to have to develop some strategies in order to reconcile those two things. And we haven't had that conversation yet, but your question, I think, is sort of leading to that logical conclusion.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, when we're the developer, we're in the driver's seat for that, right? So we can effectively increase the subsidy by just saying we're going to build a higher quality structure, but we're going to sell it to you for the same price. When it's not our hammer and not our work site, that's not the case. And so, you know, a big part of what we're doing here is trying to create a framework so that others can do that work, because we're not going to be able to achieve it all on our own. And so I want to be mindful about not undermining our work in these other three buckets with some of this. So I just want to put that out there and ask you guys to just kind of just take that in. I'm not asking for an answer right now, but, you know, and again, I don't know if we count, I mean, our mobile is not really mobile, right? Like a trailer tends to be stick-built here now as well. But is there a particular subsection by which we need some tool to sort of mitigate our own positive but also countervailing impact here?
And I would just say, you know, again, I think that eventually all of those projects, regardless of their affordable or free market or whatever, are going to be subject to, I think, the new standard energy code and building code that's going to be present in the city of Aspen.
Okay.
These other requirements right now are simply sort of associated with this particular type of development or redevelopment.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think the city already, in its role as a developer with BG3 and with Lumberyard, have already targeted higher standards than what are expected at this point, and so that we just have to translate that and apply it to the rest of the market. But I think our energy efficiency building codes are pretty high at this point. And as we move closer, I think it's IECC 2021, as we move closer to that, they're going to get even better. So there is going to be a cost, as you say, Philip, that it's going to cost more to get to where we have targeted for greenhouse gas reduction. But I still feel that those major gains are going to be made in commercial developments and older buildings. As we build new buildings, the materials and the building codes help us get there towards that our energy goals.
Absent any other questions from council, and again, we're happy to sort of go into any of these topics in more detail. These were two policy questions that were asked directly of council within the memo, and we would like to get some direction on both of these. The first, and I think this is probably the most substantial. The second one we can explain a little bit why the question's there, but the first one is really about where should we be setting this number of demolition allotments in a given year. Looking back from data going back to 2013, including a very significant number in 2021 of 15 demolitions of single family and duplex. Going back over those 9 years, the average across those 9 years is 6.5 demolitions per year. And those are projects that required a demolition permit. In a given year, there's probably another project or two at the most that cross that 40% threshold that we use to define demolition, but don't require a demolition permit. When you require a demolition permit, those are scrape and replace projects. But we've probably got another project or two at the most in a given year that sort of don't require a demolition permit, but do cross that 40% threshold. So as a consequence of that 6.5 average across those 9 years, staff feels that there's a potential range here, that it really is a policy question for council about where you would like that number to be set. I think at the maintaining status quo is probably kind of at 8, more or less. I think if you sort of want a number less than that, I think there's an opportunity to go less than that. I do think that from staff's view, kind of anything lower than 5 starts to be kind of a not recognizing the role of this development activity within our larger context, because it's what's going on right now, and it's a driver of our economy. And so I do think it's a balance. I think it's a policy question. I think staff can make an argument of something in that range that makes sense and is a defensible number. But the average across those years is 6.5, kind of scrape and replace projects with another 1 or 2 projects a year that are crossing that 40% threshold.
Thanks, Ben. Just for conversation, I'll start this off. For me, I would say 6 and yes, and invite council members for their input.
I'm happy to. John looks eager, though.
I'm with Torrey. I think 6 is a good number, not the lowest, but not the highest. And obviously, I think I agree with staff. You've run the ball this far. I trust you to continue doing a great job. I am curious about our 40% level of destruction or demo, and I do like the fact that Telluride, it kicks in at 50. Anyway.
You mean to make the standard tighter, not looser?
Yeah, I'd like to make it tighter.
Just to clarify that then a little bit, so Telluride standard is 50% of the existing structure demolished in order to constitute a demolition. So that would be less restrictive than the city's current 40%.
My misunderstanding, sorry.
So are you interested in a standard more restrictive than the 40%? So to put it another way, lower than 40%?
I'd certainly be willing to discuss it.
Okay.
And I think it was, just in response, I do think that it's a topic that staff considered and had conversations during our outreach with folks. And I think just because this in itself, kind of the policy in itself, is a fairly fundamental change from the way that we're currently doing business, we decided to stay with our current calculations and thresholds just to not throw too big of a set of uncertainties into the development community. But I do think that there's other things that we could do in terms of how we measure demolition that we're contemplating, that we need to have significant more conversation with the development community to kind of implement and to understand the impacts of changing that threshold and also the measurement calculation.
And just for council's benefit and for the benefit of the public who may be watching, that percentage calculation, not only the way we calculate it, but where the standard is set, 40%, is a significant component of this suite of regulations. And Ben, I think, stated very articulately why staff has chosen not to change that approach at this point. That's not part of our recommendations. But you identified, I think, very astutely, a very important component of this suite of regulations is how we calculate it and where that ratio is set. And changing that calculation or changing the percentage would make a meaningful difference in terms of the number of these projects that we could see in a given year. So that number, 6.5, could be fundamentally different if it's 30% or 50%. And the amount of waste going to the landfill corresponding to that would, of course, be very different as well.
Thanks.
Fred, I'm going to get some input from council. I assume you probably have some input or some comments on probably all of tonight's presentation.
Yes, I thought I'd do it by section, so I thought I'd talk to GMQS just now. And I recognize it's a work session, I'm not sure what the protocol is, but if I can make some comments about GMQS before you move on, I'd like to.
About demolition?
About demolition and the GMQS, yes, GMQS and demolition. That's the first section we're talking about, right?
Hold on to them for a
Sure.
minute.
Yeah, I appreciate this. The answer to number 2 is yes. On the first one, you know, I'm very much following kind of staff's tubes in the bumper bowling lane here. You know, these seem like small numbers, but when you think about the distinction between 5 and 6, when you're talking about a 20% jump, right? If we think about what 8% inflation felt like right now, and then you imagine that 20%'s in your backyard, it's not an insignificant difference multiplied over time. So I was initially coming in thinking 5 is where I would look and kind of feel what that is over time. We can certainly go up. You know, looking at some of the stuff in the report, I mean, a full scrape and replace from a 2006 house is shocking by any standard. And, you know, the reality is that type of choice is going to become increasingly more common as prices go up and up and up. And even though they're going up and up and up, the relative price to the net worth of the individual buying it's going to go down and down because of the shrinking of that marketplace. And, you know, I just think about like my own behavior as someone who tries to be conscious. If I have to buy an entree of food and I'm going somewhere in Aspen, it's a once a month. If I'm in northern India and it's 40 cents, I might get 4 things just to try them and throw them out. And that's unfortunate, but it's true. And so, you know, when you're paying that much and you have that much extra income, it just becomes, well, I would like it as I want it. So I think that's going to increase, and so I'd kind of rather err on the side of caution, observe the behavior, and be willing to rise as we go. That said, it's crystal ball to some degree as well, and so 6 may be the perfect number. I can't say for sure.
But your question earlier about an appeal process or the ability to come to council.
We can. And I do want more clarity on that, the mechanics, like even a 1-page flow chart before first reading of, you know, I guess I'm not clear on, you know, the 5 are allotted at the administrative level, and then do only 5 people have the opportunity to come to us in a year? At the 6, are they stopped at the gate, or could they go to 30? If we accepted 30, does that mean that for the next 6 years, there's 0? Could they still come but get queued? I don't understand how those mechanics work yet.
Ward? Comments on this?
Yeah, my thoughts are 5, and I would like to see how that plays out, knowing that we're not committing to 5 from here forward, that we can adjust up. I would look at what comes, looking for getting in the queue for the following year, and if we start getting a large number in the queue, to look at adjusting that 5 up. But the second question is yes, and my justification for 5 is I think that we're here because we feel that it's out of control, and I think to make some kind of a meaningful adjustment requires a meaningful action, and I think 5 on the lower end of that option, I would do 5, and I would monitor it, and with the realization that can be changed in the future. And I do agree with letting staff do it administratively.
Thanks, Ward.
Yeah, I have one question before, and what time do we think this program will start? You know, I'm just kind of thinking about construction season. And will we have a partial this year and then a whole new one next year? Or how do we going to do that part?
So August 8th.
Okay.
And we have not written it to have a partial set of allotments in 2022, so there would be whatever the adopted number is.
For 22, and then
At
it would
that
start
time.
again in January of 23. Okay, I was just kind of seeing how in the future it would line up with our construction seasons and planning. Thank you for that. Well, I've never been the split vote between 5 and 6 before. It's just
5.5.
You know, and I'll tell you, I'm actually a little bit on the opposite of you, Skippy and Ward, on this. I was thinking 6 as well. I'd like to avoid having to have extra push conversations in the very first 4 months of it to say, should we have more or less, and just a little more room in there is good with me. So, that's
And
that.
second question.
Oh, yeah, definitely, yes.
Sorry for you.
And, you know, I know this will all be documented when you do it, but that, I think, is the key thing, is that there's documentation, so nobody can say, well, they didn't really hit the same standard I did, or, you know, there was no favoritism about any application. Thank you.
Before we move on from this topic, any other comments or questions from council? Requests for any information? I think the flow chart, kind of in terms of process, I think is a good suggestion. We'll certainly have that ready for council at first reading, but.
The administrative appeal go to P and Z, is that right?
I'm sorry?
Administrative appeal, somebody disagrees with,
Well,
goes to P and Z?
yeah, so what would go to P and Z is a challenge to the measurement of demolition. So like if a project came in and said, we don't think we're triggering demolition based on our evaluation, P and Z could evaluate that. And if someone wanted to ask for a variance or a variation, it'd be a variation. Mr. Chu makes sure that we're clear with those words.
Linguist.
If somebody wanted a variation, they're important terms, there's no disagreement. A variation from any of the objective standards that we're setting up, they could go to P and Z and ask for a variation to any of those standards.
And P and Z is the final authority on variations.
That's correct. It'd be through special review. Yeah.
Great. Fred, if you want to come up, I'm going to give you a couple minutes, real quick. We appreciate your continued participation in these meetings. We also appreciate your perspective. So I'm going to take some public comment from you, but we have a long meeting ahead of us, so please, if you can, on this
appreciate
section,
that.
just keep it to 2 or 3 minutes. That'd be great.
Thanks, Tori. You've heard from me before. I feel like I'm kind of here to represent what sounds to me like in this conversation, the sort of forgotten little guy. This whole conversation has been about the development community and what they think and need and how they impact the town, and I appreciate that. My concern is that a guy like me, who has a building that's over 50 years old, he wants to remodel it to live in it the rest of his life, is getting pushed out the door here and is not going to have the opportunity to do that. If I'm competing for 5 allotments per year with the development community, I'm not going to get in.
To demolish your house.
To demolish and build, remodel it, yes. It's 50 years old. It can't be remodeled within the framework that it is now in the definition of the code for 40% demolition. So that's my concern when you say that you can start allocating future years out by going to council, and then you start looking at performance standards and they start throwing cherries at you if they increase the cost. They're happy to increase the cost because they pass it on to their consumer. I can't even think about it. I'm not sure I can do the cost now the way inflation is going, to tell you the truth. But I'd like you to keep that in mind, especially in this GMQS conversation. And, in my view, if you're going to only have 5 a year, maybe 1 of those or 2 of those ought to be set aside for someone who's going to be living in their house and not just for the development community. Secondarily, but similarly, if you have an application for a GMQS allotment for someone who wants to tear down a 2006 home, competing against someone who wants to tear down a 1960 home, it seems to me the 1960 home ought to win hands down. I think that you need to think about how you're impacting the guy like me who wants to take an old house and fix it up so he can continue to live in it for the rest of his life. I'm not the only one here doing that. And those costs, I'm sure the development community says, yeah, we like high standards because they can pass those costs on. I like high standards too, and I pay for them when I can, but we all make choices. I don't necessarily buy the most expensive stove for my house because I can't afford it, even if it is the best. So I just like you to keep that in mind when you start talking these numbers and with limitations and who's competing. These developers, they have staffs that are churning these applications out daily, and they're going to be all in line long before I even think about it. So those are my thoughts on that GMQS issue.
I think you've already thought about it, Fred.
Thank you.
Good comments.
And through a lot of the conversations we've had, we've been talking about protecting local residents, resident occupied, and the like. So that's not new for you to hear, but in this process, are we talking about a similar categorization or allotment, or not at this time?
At this time, I think the focus of staff's kind of response to local concerns has been on the mitigation topic and the deferral agreement, and making sure that has, will become a more predictable document for folks. I do think that, Mr. Pierce's comments, and Fred and I have had some good conversations about these things. I do think that inherently, you put limits on the number of demolitions, and it applies equally across to everybody. Now, if council is interested in finding carve-outs, as Mr. Pierce kind of suggested, staff can contemplate those things and try to figure out some mechanisms for how to negotiate that. But at this time, staff has not contemplated a kind of differentiating people who would be applying for a demolition allotment.
I had in my notes, and John already brought it up about what triggers demolition. Scapia asked you this question earlier, and I watched all the heads going like this. But in my notes, I had set standards for demolition, building age, size, energy usage, and displaced housing as qualifications to have a scoring for demolition permits. So Fred really tied me back into what my notes had originally said. I know it makes it a lot more difficult for staff to come up with a scoring process, but those are my thoughts on it.
With respect to the idea of a sort of scoring process, and correct me if this is the wrong way to frame this, but part of the challenge that staff has conceived of in thinking about a scoring process or not is, once you institute a scoring process, you have to be able to compare the applications to each other.
Compare what?
You have to be able to compare the applications to each other. And so in that way, you have to have a fundamentally different system where all the applications are coming in at once, and we're getting into the competition system, which our department's experience over decades trying to run that competition system was that it is fraught with peril, to use a term that we use downstairs sometimes. It is a very, very challenging set of rules to try and manage, and is very different legal territory than uniform rules and that are sort of applied across every project that comes through our department. And so that's a major challenge that we've had a difficult enough time trying to reconcile, that we landed with the recommendations that are before you in your packet.
So a scoring process like this would mean that once a year you would issue those permits.
That's correct.
After all of the applications have been submitted.
That's correct. And I, in response to Mr. Pierce's comments, because we have heard this frequently over the course of this process and over the course of my tenure with the city, and in other communities in which I've worked where there are similar pressures on development in town. And you've heard me say this before, and I'll probably end up saying it again at some point in the future, but it is extremely challenging for communities like Aspen to respond to the pressures that the community feels from development, and simultaneously recognize the degree to which those responses may be counterproductive to the interests of other members of our community. And that is frankly an irreconcilable tension, as best as I've been able to identify it professionally. And whether it's about affordable housing mitigation costs or demolition allotments, or any of the other myriad standards that we put in place in a responsive way to try and protect community character and deliver public goods, every one of those regulations that's put in place is another step down the path towards regulations that are responsive to the outside pressure, as opposed to regulations that are responsive to the perceived, at least, or if not real needs of our year-round residents. And so we are very cognizant of that tension, and do our best to respond to it. But it is a major challenge, and this is just another example of that dynamic playing out.
Yeah, I can really appreciate what you're saying there. It's very hard to reconcile our differences sometimes, and there seems to be a little pain on either side of that when we do. But I do like the concept, if there was a way to look at a set-aside for a resident who has been a traditional resident, has lived here for a period of time, is Colorado resident, paying Colorado taxes as a standard, and then if none were claimed in the course of that year, be available for others. But I think at least making a dual track so that we recognize there's a difference between an LLC that's just bought a piece of property that sees it as a large spec home project, and someone who has lived here, is continuing to live here, and would like to live here. Now, I'll be the first to say, I know that circumstances change. And when the Poss family came in and were redeveloping the Limelight, they were so excited to be able to run that hotel like that. And then the recession hit, and they hadn't, made everything come together at once, and they ended up selling it because they needed to. So you might well have families come in who are that long-term local family, and by the time they finish the construction, someone's died and part of their family, and they're going to move away after all. And they may have gotten into that line a little sooner because they were that local, but now they move. I'd like to think that that's going to be your rarity. But I think that if it's, we had a little disagreement about 5 or 6 up here at the table, if we make one set aside no matter what each year for a living local and see how that goes, that might be a way to do it. I think it is a interesting dynamic of need versus demand. Someone living in a 50-year-old home and wanting to get rid of that energy efficiency, that's a real need. And it's not a new phenomenon. I mean, the DeWolfs tore down the house next to them to build a garden, and someone else tore down a house out by the meadows to be able to have a better view at the meadows. So, people have bought and just made lots vacant in this town before because they have that ability. So it's not a new thing. But that's where I would go with it if I could. Thank you.
Skippy?
Yeah. Forgive me for just kind of talking through this before I come to a conclusion, but I really appreciate your comments. And this is a big part of what I was kind of getting at with some of that lower category, and I appreciate you elevating my perspective on it to homes with maybe greater current value, but yet in the family for a really long time. It seems to me that there's sort of 2 tracks on which competing gets difficult, right? One is the sort of ability or agency to apply. And I guess I don't quite understand. January 1, if 5 of these allotments haven't, or if any of the coming year's allotments haven't been pre-assigned at the council table, is this like a Burning Man ticket scenario where we're waiting at 12:01 a.m. and the first person in gets it? Is that sort of how it is?
I think my only response to that is, again, the design and the development of a concept is going to have to be far enough down the road. And so, but I do think that that's going to, like, if 6 projects or 5 projects show up on January 1 that are complete applications, that are compliant with the objective standards that we're putting in place, they're going to be sort of allocated to those projects very early on in the year, and the rest of the year is going to be requests to council as it's currently imagined.
Okay. So yes with qualifiers.
Yes.
And so, just it seems to me if we're somewhere in the ballpark of demand, then, you're not really at a huge disadvantage because you have the same agency to press send on that completed file, so to speak. If we're way off demand and there's 50 projects a year that want this, then we're sort of at the basis of internet speeds or chance or what have you, in which case I think Rachel's suggestion would make sense as a carve-out. I just don't know if that's needed or not, but I'm happy to err on the side of supporting locals in that process. If it's the other concern that we're just artificially inflating already these crazy building costs, which to some degree we're doing, then, I really do think we need some deeper level of thought on how to address that. What Ward was talking about with the scoring criteria, and just hear me, I'm talking through this. I'm not saying let's go do scoring criteria, but, you know, with one of his criteria being displacement of workers, that would create an objective but weighted system that would give an advantage to a local who's not displacing workers. And so that does, to me, seem to be an architecture that can begin to reconcile the irreconcilable. And that may not be the right one, but there are mechanisms there that we can tease out. And so I just think giving a deeper level of thought, because I keep going back, and it's just, you know, one of those things that stood out for me. But last time I was out knocking doors, I was in the trailer park and, you know, talked to somebody who, you know, his father, his family had been there their entire life, born and raised here, wanted to stay here, had a good job, the whole thing, but the structure's literally falling down around him. And he's saying, and these are his numbers, and they may be totally wrong, but at the time, like, I could replace my home for $300,000, but all the other stuff I gotta pay is another $300,000, and I don't have $600,000. And, you know, my response at the time was like, you're not the person we're trying to punish, but between then and now, he had no other option. He sold it, and he's gone forever. And that family lineage is gone forever, and that tradition of Aspen is gone forever. And so I don't want to see more of that, regardless of whether our home has wheels or not, you know, so.
Sarah?
I'm going to go out on a limb saying this to the council, but I would encourage you to not use your demolition code language to be your spigot valve to the level that I'm hearing in this conversation. It makes me a little nervous, honestly, that you have much better tools in your zoning code to be using. So when it comes to demolition, I would encourage simplicity so there is clarity for the community over there's other controls elsewhere that can address some of these things that I've heard tonight. Thank you.
Thanks.
I appreciate that, and the outcome is what's important, not the selection of the input amongst many, right? And so I guess, thanks for letting me talk around that. This is complicated stuff, but I would like I would request that staff give some more thought to this circumstance and how we may begin to alleviate it.
Well, and I would just say as a quick response, because I know we have other topics to talk about, but I do think that a couple things need to be acknowledged. Yeah. There were 15 demolition permits last year. Yeah. And we're dropping that number significantly. Yep. So the competition here is going to be, yep. Without having a competition system, but the competition for these allotments will be, we think, significant, yep. Particularly in these first couple of years. Yeah. So I do think that it's a topic worth acknowledging. I will say that staff has contemplated age of home as a criteria to try to figure into this. It's challenging because it becomes somewhat arbitrary. You know, there were homes built in 1990 that were much better built than homes that were, or I should say that there were homes built in 1990 that were not built as well as some homes that were built in 1965, right? And so, like, differentiating those is a little bit arbitrary. And I will also say, and you know, I've talked to Fred about this. You know, I do think that one of the things we struggle with as we're responding to these concerns, which I think are fully valid and I 100% acknowledge, is that home, it still has the kind of same impacts regardless of who's living in it or who's redeveloping it. And to try to differentiate on the kind, you know, I think to acknowledge the things that you're, you know, suggesting we acknowledge and trying to avoid, kind of the outcome that you're trying to avoid, like getting at that from a regulatory or policy perspective is really difficult because you're making assumptions about what people are going to do with that property forever. And, you know, we hear pretty commonly in community development, this is going to be my forever home. This is my family's home. Sure. And a year later, it becomes something fundamentally different after it, you know, market forces transact and change things. So, like, responding to that dynamic is difficult for us. I think Philip kind of acknowledged this in some of his previous comments.
All right. I want to move on our agenda. The comments that Fred brought forward are comments that we are all keenly aware of. There's concern up here. You've heard from this end of the table that there's a possibility for local allotments. You've heard from this end of the table that there's other considerations, scoring, all this. I appreciate all the input. I think it's great. You guys have done a great job of putting that in your main computers and figuring it out and going forward for us. So I want to leave it there. we're just all getting our clearest picture of this right now. So this is good for us to be chewing on it. It's good to have the public input that we got tonight. We're gonna get some more, I'm sure. But let's just move forward. We know what our goals are. We know what we're trying to achieve. And if we can get there, we're gonna get there. So let's move to the next topic. We're gonna have to summarize at the end of this meeting.
Affordable housing mitigation, this is the next primary sort of policy topic. This is picking up on the tabled ordinance 24, series of 2021. And I think the framing of this hasn't changed so much from that discussion that we had with you at the end of 2021. We're wanting to include subgrade areas, basements, and garages in the mitigation requirements. We're wanting to eliminate the credit for existing floor area in demolition and redevelopment scenarios. We heard in the conversation, both at the time Ordinance 24 was being discussed and subsequent conversations in the public engagement, that the deferral agreement for locals was a really essential tool in this, and it needed some improvements, to be frank. And then lastly, council gave us direction when Ordinance 24 was tabled to update the residential employee generation study. That is in process. We're starting to get some preliminary numbers out of that effort, and all of that stuff is being contemplated right now. We need to do a little bit of, just to make sure that we're all talking about the same things as we're chatting about these topics. The levers of affordable housing mitigation, there's 4 of them that are in the land use code. And we're talking about changing a couple of these. First, and most important to staff, and this is what Ordinance 24 was about, was what counts in terms of floor area. Right now, we do not count basements, we do not count garages. We give a credit for the existing floor area when something's scraped and replaced. The employee generation rate, currently, that's essentially 0.16 FTEs per 1,000 square feet of new floor area. And that is, that number comes from an evaluation both of construction and the long-term operations and maintenance of a building. That's a lever that we have. The mitigation rate is currently at 100% and has been at 100% for this land use type. Lodge and commercial are at 65%. We've had some conversations with council when we've been asked the question, why are those different? So that's a lever that we have. And then the fee in lieu was last updated in May of 2021. This council was involved in that process, and we're going to be coming to you with an ordinance as part of this package proposing an increase of 8%, which sounds pretty low, but using the metrics that we have that we identified in the code, that our consultants identified at the time, 8% seems like a reliable and conservative number towards that increase. This is snipped out of the memo. It's the scenario that kind of we framed these topics through. And the table tries to give a comparison of where we've been on this topic over the last, say, 10 years or so. 2013, at that time, the mitigation rate was established within APSHA rules. It was not in the land use code, it was in APSHA guidelines. And at the time, for a long time, it was 1 FTE per 3,000 square feet of new floor area. Now that was, again, sort of getting rid of the existing, or including the existing credit, not including basements, et cetera. But you can kind of see across time, if we took that 2013 methodology, used our current fee in lieu, I gave some numbers just to kind of show the valuation of that. And in 2015, we did this new study, completely new mitigation requirement, and it's had the effect of significantly dropping sort of mitigation requirements from what we'd been doing previously. And in staff's proposed methodology that was generally lined out in Ordinance 24, we're really changing what counts towards that. Mitigation rates, we think, is going to be roughly, or the generation rate, roughly the same. And then we've got a policy question for council about what to do with the mitigation rate. But I think that what we need to sort of all kind of be thinking about is that these 4 levers together that we can make policy adjustments to are really about trying to get an assessment of what a unit of affordable housing costs, and what the responsibility is for development towards that cost. And I think that's ultimately the decision that the council is making as we land on what these numbers are. You know, the situation that we have currently has been based on a whole series of council decisions over a couple decades. And, you know, you have a choice about, you know, whether to change some of those things. The table at the bottom here is kind of a preliminary table from RRC, our consultant who's working on this. This is really new information that we're just getting our hands on. And it's, I think, going to still be in flux. There's some assumptions that are built in that I think we're still working through, but I think we're getting pretty close. And essentially what they've done is the average construction valuation per 1,000 square feet of heated floor area. Some of this is from the assessor's tables, some of it's from our building permit records. They've gone out and looked at nationally available data sets for picking Garfield construction workers and an evaluation of how much value a construction worker sort of produces in a given year, and then has done some division, and we're landing on generally about 0.1 FTEs per 1,000 square feet per construction worker. So that meets that first category, construction. The second piece is a little bit more difficult, and RSC is still working on these numbers. Again, we're starting to get some kind of preliminary numbers out of it, but on the operations and maintenance piece, and this was true in 2015 when we did the work, data is difficult to access, requires some creative solutions. A lot of times we can't just go out to property managers and ask what's going on in these homes. They're often bound by non-disclosure agreements, so getting at like property-specific responses to how many employees are working on a particular house in a given year. I think we all hear anecdotes, but to get numbers that are reliable are difficult. When we did in 2015, we used surveys. I think there were some questions about, you know, the data that we got back from that. There's significant variability across specific properties. This is one of the things that, in talking with locals, we've talked about these mitigation requirements. They're like, I shovel my own snow. Other people have, you know, 3 professional chefs at their home when they're there. And so there's this huge difference in variability across specific properties. We are proposing this elimination of credit for existing floor area. That adds some complexity to dealing with the operations and maintenance over the lifespan of a home. And then lastly, as we sort of start to look at STR fees and taxes, there's intersections with that. And so we're trying to sort of make some adjustments across to account for all of those things as we land on a final number. It's coming. Certainly we'll have it by first reading, but we're making some last minute adjustments on these things. Any questions on this? Yeah.
Just to clarify, so the estimate of 0.1 is just for the construction,
Just for the
and
construction.
there'll be the additional
Yeah.
of that
Yeah.
coming up. Okay, and we're basically trying to find the average of all those different uses in that big range.
Yeah, and I think this gives a, sort of a good comparison here. This kind of shows what it was in 2015. We've got construction, operations, and maintenance. As we've kind of done a new analysis, construction looks like it's going to be landing approximately 0.1. Operations and maintenance is 0.15. You can see what it was in the 2015 study, but we're still landing kind of as we sort of try to understand all these variables that are present and think about, again, this kind of cost recovery around, you know, this development activity towards the affordable housing generation that they're sort of responsible for, like what's appropriate, what's council's expectations around those things.
Yeah, and then the second question is around the existing floor area,
Yeah.
which I totally agree with this direction, but what's not clear to me, so now there's a house that hasn't mitigated, and so when it gets replaced or whatever, it now has to mitigate for that total square footage.
Yeah.
When that house disappears and the next one comes up, and so the previous one has mitigated and it hasn't grown a square foot,
Yeah.
does it have to mitigate all over again, or is it then exempt because it's mitigated for that existing square footage?
Did it trigger demolition?
Well, let's say yes and no, so I understand both.
Yeah, so right now, and I think it's one of the incentives not to cross that 40% threshold.
Got it.
Is that all, you know, in a significant remodel, all you'd be on the hook for is additional square footage.
Got it.
If you do trigger that 40%, that's when we're coming back on the credit.
Understood.
I will say that just conceptually, the construction piece is really easy because you tear down a house, you build a new house, you should be on the hook for that entirety of that new construction impact. I do think that it raises some questions about the operations and maintenance piece, because that is calculated over kind of the lifespan of a home. And if a home doesn't meet its full lifespan and sort of redevelops in that time period, what do you do sort of around that? And so we're, it's one of the details that we're still trying to arrive at a fair response to.
And given our existing data set, we have at least 16 years to worry about it. Okay. 2006 demolition.
And
That
then
made no sense.
I put this back up again just if in case people wanted to work through it. I'm happy not to talk about this any further if people don't have questions. But I do think from staff's perspective, the real fundamental policy change is what's being counted towards mitigation.
Yep.
And I think as we look back, mitigation per square foot, roughly parallel to what's been done previously. But the real change, and I'm not acknowledging that it's not a significant change, is what's being counted and what that translates into in terms of mitigation responsibilities.
Yeah.
And again, this gets kind of at the cost recovery thing. Just kind of simple graphic up at the top that all these things are toggles that we can sort of mess it. I will say that the combined impact of this is that we're trying to get it at direct nexus and proportionality. It's something that's required anytime a community engages in an impact fee. We need to make sure that we're staying true to those kind of standards of accountability as we sort of arrive at the number that's appropriate. I will just say, just to kind of give you some comparison numbers, and as you're thinking about this, in no world, kind of going back to this last slide, do I think that $425,000 on a project like this is an insignificant number? It's a very significant number. But when we think about what it costs to build a single one-bedroom unit in this town and the dollar figures that are associated with that and what the expectations are of this kind of development towards sort of meeting our affordable housing needs, like those numbers start to not seem so unreasonable when you think about the costs that they're attempting to respond to on the development of affordable housing side. Okay, a couple questions. These were both stated in the memo. Around this mitigation rate, I've heard comments from council members in previous discussions on this topic about the mitigation rate. And this is kind of in those series of levers, kind of the third of them that we have some control over right now, and it's been this case for forever in the land use code, is that this type of development was responsible for 100% of its employee generation. Lodge and commercial are currently sitting at 65%. And the question is, as we sort of move these levers around in the total calculation of mitigation responsibility, does council desire us to bring this mitigation requirement down to the 65% threshold or 100% or some other number?
Rachel, start down with you.
Yeah, thank you. It strikes me that they were doing 100% in the past, but with so much floor area exempted that it really wasn't actually mitigating at 100%. There was a lot of credit for unmitigated portions of the home or property in the past. If we're going forward with the full mitigation in those areas, to me, it would make sense to bring the threshold down some. But I would want to question, should perhaps lodge and commercial development also consider starting to come up at this time? Do we take the housing mitigation down to 75% and bring commercial up to 75%? To reach parity, but I don't know that going down to 65%, even with the new areas that are being counted, is really much of a gain. And if we're really there to make new housing, then it needs to be a gain. There's one other thing I think we really should point out or keep in mind during all this discussion, because this is a lot of costs, there's a lot of things like that. And I would like to mentally separate from the little guy, the existing homeowner who's here, and talk about kind of the development money that's coming into town. those folks who are producing a product they believe will make a profit, that someone will want to come buy that spec home, they're benefiting from all the affordable housing that was created before them. They're able to sell a town that has some semblance of a workforce left because of housing that was created that they did not contribute to. And so this is all additive. And, you know, when you say, hey, it's going to be a great new 7,500 square foot home, look at these high costs I'm having to pay, but I actually have a fire department, and I have a police department, and I have the benefit of employees who will pick me up on the ski slopes and things like that. So, you know, it's easy enough to say, why am I paying for all this? It's only one employee, but you're actually getting all the work that had been done before, and that's part of why you're choosing this community. Thank you.
Is there an opportunity for that, the conversation about raising the 65% for lodge and commercial development and setting those, if we're looking for parity between those, is that opportunity in front of us?
The way that Ordinance 6, 2022 was written really didn't open the land use code up, nor did the policy resolution associated with the moratorium. Didn't open the land use code up for us to be able to amend those particular sections. We fully recognize that the conversation around affordable housing mitigation and the relationship between development activities and sort of adopted community policy is an ongoing conversation. And so we're open to having that conversation in the future, but right now we're fairly constrained by Ordinance 6 and the associated policy resolution.
Okay. But it could be a start towards that. Skippy, then?
Yeah, appreciate that. And I'd also just say, you know, to your guys' point, I say this out loud, so tell me if I'm wrong about this, but a situation with a local, this stuff gets deferred, I think in an appropriate way. So while this number may look large, as long as you're living in that property, this doesn't apply to you. If you sell it to someone who meets our requirement, it doesn't apply to you. It's only when you convert that structure from its use of housing, local worker, to not doing it, that you pay. And I think that's appropriate because the community takes a big loss and it creates an incentive to sell to a local that I think is really, really helpful. And so hear all that. Also hear Rachel's point about we're increasing the area. That said, I would not move it a tick off 100%. You know, to me, if I think about the impact to the community, the harm to the community in this area, right? Because I'm not saying that these people or homeowners or uses are harmful, but in terms of having housing here, there's two ways this new development hurts us, right? It is, one, the employees generated in building and maintaining and running that property, but as we've talked about, the far bigger one, the 90% of the iceberg, is the displacement of the person that used to live there. And in many ways, we're playing catch up to 30 years of that process. Rachel, you know, you talk about it happening in Glenwood now. It's been happening here. Well, this is how we're catching up, and it would have been nice had we been doing it the whole time, but we are. And so to me, even though this is a big number, it doesn't get at the vast majority of the impact to housing our local workforce. So knowing that, I don't want to pour water into the bucket just to poke holes in the bottom. That just does not make any sense to me. And yes, I do support this CPI.
Okay.
Can I do a follow-up?
Sure, Rachel.
I support question number 2 there. Thank you. I support item number 2 with the consumer price index. I think that makes sense. But what I was going to ask is, when we use that term construction and then maintenance of the residence, does maintenance also include what I would think of as servicing the house? So that if you're having floral deliveries or you having private chef three times a week, we're somehow capturing part-time workers that service the house, not just maintenance in the classic sense of keeping the systems running?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you for that. I can see what Skippy is saying on that. I wouldn't fight on that to keep it, to bring it down.
More input, John?
Yes, I believe the mitigation rate for residential development should remain at 100%. I think we're finally there, and that's where we want to be. And question 2, yes.
Thanks, John. Ward, your thoughts?
Yeah, the easy one is number 2, and the first one, first question is the one that, it's 100%. How do you calculate it? We look at, 2015 to now, 1.13 FTE versus 0.2 FTE. So when you play around with the numbers that you calculate, what the FTE is, it really affects a lot. And so this is opening up a can of worms, what we've talked about it in the past when we were even discussing ordinance 24, is that should there be allowed subgrade space lot line to lot line, or should it just be under the building itself? Is 7,500 square feet a reasonable number? Should we be looking at decreasing that? Should the ratio for a garage be calculated at a lower rate than living space, what would be net livable space? So we've increased what we're mitigating on. So what we're winding up with is a lot higher number. So I think that a new construction, that price is going to be passed right along to the new owner. It's going to be a small increase to the cost of the new owner, and it's something that should be passed along to the new owner. But it just seems like the calculations have changed. What we're counting have really driven up what that 100% translates to. So I don't know if I want to go back and start looking at how much of a basement is allowed, and if garage space should be calculated at a lower rate. Right now, they're totally exempted. And do we want to make a full switch to 100% mitigation on everything that's allowed, or should we be decreasing what's allowed? So that's where I'm.
Yeah, it's a tough question, but if I'm recalling this process earlier, and the feedback from the development community was, don't decrease what we can build, make us mitigate for it fully.
Yeah.
But they were the ones who were saying, no, don't tell us it has to be a smaller garage and a smaller basement or a smaller house.
Yeah, I remember the level of objection to that. So
Yeah.
I guess it's a tough pill to swallow, but I'll accept the full removal of the exemptions for subterranean space and garages, and go with 100% mitigation with the extended of the deferral agreements for locals. And if a local is going to be living in the space that the local sells, that deferment passes, and so that they're not paying mitigation. I agree with setting the price of the mitigation at the time of the building permit, and it escalates at the CPI. That adds a known quantity to what the increase of cost is going to be if it indeed sells to a non-working resident.
Yes, on the second question. I don't know. I'm interested in this conversation. I was looking forward to this tonight. I guess my input here is that I'm so glad that we are not exempting basement space, which is actual lived-in space. That I appreciate Rachel's comment about maybe meeting residential and large commercial somewhere in the middle. At this time, I'm supportive of 100%. I think that's where we need to start. We've spent a lot of time, a lot of money on getting really accurate impact studies. and I appreciate that. So at this time, I'm supportive of that direction. I do feel like there is more conversation around this that could get us to where we eventually want to be, but we won't know that until we do a little bit more work and put something in place. Again, top priority, aside from actually mitigating for real built livable, is the deferral agreements for locals. I think that there might be a more complicated route to get to a better formula or solution, result, mitigation, impact fee, but as long as we're feeling that the residential locals lived in, occupied, has a relief from this, I'm comfortable there. So starting with this as a starting framework, I believe in, but again, I think this is the first time that we're getting this clearest picture, as well as the options that you bring forward for us as well. So I think that there's more work here, but I support where you're at and where this council was.
I'd like to kind of add on that is that it seems like a real crux of this is how often we adjust the fee in lieu rate and what we base that on. Construction inflation is really high, and I want to try to keep that number adjusted frequently so that the actual cost of fee in lieu mitigation represents the cost of construction to actually deliver a workforce housing unit.
Understood. And just, I was just going to say for council's clarity, when we get to first reading, a lot of the sort of uncertainty that were in those models will be resolved, and we'll have a recommendation kind of around those different levers that are kind of were just identified as we sort of, particularly on the employee generation rate.
I want to invite Fred up. He's been looking at this particular question for a while, as well as some others. So Fred, why don't you come on up again? I want to get your quick input on this. Again, I'll remind you that we're actually a little behind on schedule now, so.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Thank you.
So again, representing the small minority of people that I'm represented, i.e. me, and anyone else in my shoes. Just as a quick aside, I feel like that the counting of 100% of the FAR in the mitigation for the maintenance operations from an existing is overreach. That's just my opinion. I totally get it in the construction, because it is all new construction. I feel like for those of us that have maintained and operated for 50 years or whatever, that it's overreach. But I'm resigned myself that that's not going to change. So, and I appreciate the deferral agreement. That is a nice way to try to deal with the issue. There's one thing about the deferral agreement I'd like you to consider, and that is this. For those of us who paid big mortgages for a long period of time to live in a free market, that is in many respects our 401k or our IRA. And when you take a chunk like we're talking about here out of that, that's a big chunk of my savings technically that I might use. And you say, well, but you're going to live there. And I say, yes, but when I get to that point where I'm retired and I need income, I may very well want to do like a reverse mortgage, for example, to take equity out so I can continue to live there until I die. And if I lose $500,000 of equity in my house, that reverse mortgage disappears to some extent, or at least the amount of it does. So I'd like you to consider, and I discussed this with Ben a little bit, some sort of a depreciation factor, so that if I have for discussion purposes, a $300,000 affordable housing mitigation fee when I remodel, and if I live there for 10 years and then want to get a reverse mortgage or whatever, maybe that 300 could go down some percentage per year for 10 years, so it's now maybe 100,000 or 150 or something, so it decreases the burden to some extent. That's my only thought.
Thank you.
I appreciate you bringing that up at this time, because it's something I've been sort of noodling on as well. There are number of members in our community I've heard from who are in that sort of, and I hope this isn't pejorative, it's not intended to be, but like house rich, cash poor, right? And they're coming up in their years, and the reverse mortgage is a tool that's out there to deal with it. But I wondered if we could start noodling on, is there a mechanism that could provide cash to the individual that would have the same benefit to the homeowner, but would convey more benefit to the city? So could the city, out of, say, the 150 fund, offer a lump sum payment rather than a more reverse mortgage? It buys an RO deed restriction. That person could then own that house, benefit from that income, and their estate or their children could still have it, but the city gets more from it, and that person gets the benefit of knowing they've deeded something. I know that's a little askew, but I was really happy to hear Fred bring that up, because I think it's something we should start thinking about if we haven't.
Sounds like morphing, a decreasing mitigation with time, with buy down.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different way to get at it, and maybe there's a partnership where there's a developer who's going to turn that into whatever.
Sure.
But just to throw that out there.
Yeah, I will say in response to Mr. Pierce's comments and our previous conversations, and a few other members of the community here in his exact same circumstance, I have made a commitment to sort of bring this question of some sort of a mechanism of depreciation of that amount to council for consideration post-moratorium. It's on one of our, in a kind of our list of priorities to bring back to you in the second half of 2022 to start thinking about that as a possibility.
Yeah, and so I guess my ask is to think about how that mechanism could serve our long-term housing goals by acquiring a deed restriction in some way that provides benefit to the homeowner now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Understood.
I have empathy here, but I also want to make sure we're not going down a slippery slope that says that essentially every home that is free market now that someone's lived in will not be paying mitigation in the future. I mean, even as they're remodeled, and, I just question the type of money we would put into creating RO units in town for what sound like essentially people when they've chosen to retire in a free market home, and hoping that at some point it's going to be an RO worker who it's sold to in the future, at $4 million RO worker instead of a $8 million free market. I mean, it's just, I don't know that that's a rabbit hole I would want to put my resources into, or time of staff. And again, if it's 10 years and it depreciates down to 0, or 15 years down to 0, and now there's going to be no mitigation on that home when it's sold to the new person for, it's no longer due. How many exemptions do we create? Would it be potential of 100 free market homes that would never mitigate because we've decided to depreciate it down over time while they're retired? Or is it 250? I don't know, but it could be an awful lot of homes that you're saying don't really have to mitigate because you lived here and you benefited from all the affordable housing workers who created our economy. But when you sell, it's over because you've remodeled already, and your mitigation is gone now.
Well, I appreciate that point, and what I really hear is how much money do we want to put into an asset that's going to be so expensive, and is that the best use of our funds? I will say, the $1.5 million North 40 home on the free market is $12 million. The delta is really big. That could change. There is, if we project out and we look at the increasing cost of all property, there's going to be an expanding missing middle where anyone professional over a certain level is out. So I do think it's important to think about, but I guess my point is, rather than depreciating to 0, why not get something of value in return? And maybe RO isn't what we want, and maybe we don't want it to be single family, but if there's a cash payment and there's a partner who's a developer later on that puts in 4 smaller units, I mean, I don't know, but rather than having that property.
But we're setting a policy that's going to either say it depreciates down and you don't have to by August 8th, or we're not. And, I like all the theoretical ideas of maybe this could happen at some point in the future, but policy is either going to say you're deferred and just stay there for 10 more years, you don't owe any mitigation on the new remodel that's going to make your home sell for a lot more than it did originally, or we're not gonna mitigate, you know, I just don't see this in-between world.
I don't think that you're
Existing.
hearing what I'm saying.
Hold on a second. First of all, a depreciation program does not need to be in place by August 8th. That's not part of this policy decision. We can do that later. And as a matter of fact, on a looser timeline, because we're talking about 10 years, 20 years, whatever it may be.
It's different.
Skippy brings up some possibilities, putting thoughts into the cloud bubble up there, with no expectations except for conversation. You're so great to point out a guardrail right there, and I was watching Steph kind of go like, yeah. So I think they understand that your goal is one that's shared up here.
Yeah,
We are not
yeah.
looking for elimination of mitigation. That is not what we're trying to do.
Right.
But in this conversation that goes on for locals, it will continue. It is second part of this year after moratorium to get more detail on this. So Rachel, I appreciate your
yeah.
comments at this time. I think they're timely because as Ben goes forward, he'll be conscientious of that, as well as Skippy's comments of saying, hey, maybe there's an opportunity here to turn this around and make work in our
Yeah, instead of
benefit.
depreciating it to zero, let's actually convey something for that benefit that they're asking for.
Understand, I think they're intrigued to think about that a little bit. Ward?
Yeah, I agree with this, looking at a buy-down policy in exchange for something, a depreciation and mitigation. But I don't want to get into a position where we're doing ready, aim, and never fire. So I think that we should go forward what we have and realize that there's some real opportunities to suss out a program that we maybe can backfill from the 150 in exchange when they sell. I don't know what it is now, but I don't want to get into that level of detail now.
All the best minds are on it.
Okay. That good there?
It's good.
Okay, great.
Okay. These next couple of topics, I think will perhaps be a little bit more expedient in terms of the conversation. There are some questions associated with them, but
Never say that.
It's our last ski run. Everything will be
it's
fine.
it's an educated guess. We've talked with council about this before. I think when this was particularly true in the case studies that we received from Design Workshop and kind of our own research that we've done, kind of looking at what other communities are doing. The review process for affordable housing projects nationally is an issue. They're often difficult, they're often unpredictable, they're often expensive, and I think they're a hindrance to people who, it's an easier path often to go after free market, not only in this community but in others. And so looking both at Aspen's context and other communities, like trying to make a streamlined, more predictable process for affordable housing project review is really essential. It sets a foundation. I think the economics of this place are difficult enough. We're going to have to do some additional work on trying to find additional incentives and subsidies and those kinds of things. But this is a really important foundational piece, not only for private sector development of affordable housing, but also public sector development of affordable housing. And so for projects that are fully compliant with the land use code, they're consistent with underlying zoning, underlying zone district requirements for dimensions, for parking, for residential design standards, APSHA regulations and requirements, and I am using variances correctly here. They don't need any variances. In this case, staff is proposing an administrative review for those. Right now, they go to P&Z. We would be including kind of for these projects a more robust development review committee. One, just to make sure again that the point of this is to make sure that projects are getting to building permit in better shape so that the review process during building permit is a little bit more streamlined, expedient, et cetera. It's an additional service that we'd be providing for these projects as they come kind of initially for land use review. And so, I think we've heard support from council for the general purpose, or for the general policy previously. But as we have looked at how this is going to play out, we know that there is opportunity for affordable housing development in our historic districts. We know that there is opportunity for affordable housing projects on designated properties. you know, and we've seen a couple of these lately with the Poppies project. I think was really a successful project. We've got a couple of those that are in the works and a couple more around town that people are thinking about. The 1020 East Cooper project kind of fit into this category. But in that effort to make affordable housing projects that are compliant, consistent with an administrative review, one of the challenges we run into are the kind of design review components of a historic preservation review. That you know, all of these projects would trigger an HPC review, probably for a major project, and that review has been really important, I think, to the integrity of our historic preservation program in general. I think it's translated into sort of better designs. I mean, the Poppies project is a consequence of real scrutiny from HPC as that project was being contemplated. And so I think we're struggling with how we create a streamlined process with the importance of the kind of design review requirements of HPC when those two things intersect, when we have an affordable project that we're trying to have a more predictable review process with the kind of importance and the integrity of the HP review process. So the question is asking from council's perspective, and you know, I proposed 3 different kind of responses that we could make in the memo, but as you think about this issue, what is your desire to try to balance these two kind of competing interests of, one, the board review of HPC with kind of the desire to try to make a more streamlined process?
Ward? Oh, sorry. Thought you had it.
Well, yeah. Underlying, you know, the floor area ratio, how much can be built by the underlying zoning, you can wind up with more units with the same amount of floor area development. You know, obviously it has some kind of impact on the parking, but in the review process, I think specifically at 1020 that we lost an affordable housing unit that could have been built by underlying zoning because of HPC review. So I want to retain the integrity of the HPC program. I don't know how you're going to handle the floor area bonus that HPC projects have available, but I would favor the third option that you had listed, is to take it out of the HPC's purview for these projects. I'm in favor of increasing the amount of units that can be on a lot that's allowable if it's 100% affordable. And I would even, I mean, we talked about fourplex a little later on. I mean, even if you want to have some, a higher number of smaller units, I could support that, I think, or at least discuss that. But to keep the amount of development within what's allowed in the zone district, I think is prudent. To increase the number of units 100% affordable, I agree with. And I would like to see it administratively handled, yet retaining the integrity of the historic preservation program.
Rachel and then Skippy.
Yeah,
Thanks, Ward.
a couple of questions first. Just, I know you went straight to historic preservation, but on the administrative review for non-historic, would there be noticing, and how would public comment to the administrators who are going to be doing the reviewing?
Under current code,
Okay.
an administrative review, there's not notice until the development order is issued. And so it's after the administrative review. There's been what we call a notice of approval issued, which is the administrative equivalency of a resolution or an ordinance. It's
Yeah.
what we sort of record. And at that point, a development order is issued, and then there's a notice requirement in the newspaper that approval has been granted. And so as currently contemplated, it would follow that development review process and that notice requirement. But in terms of front-loading public engagement or public comment in that administrative review process. That is not something that the staff is contemplating at this time. But I do want to just say that these are for projects that are 100% compliant with the land use code.
Right.
These are not projects that are, if a project needed to pursue a planned development, for example, where
Yeah.
they were asking for dimensional exemptions and use exemptions or whatever, that absolutely would go through a fully robust public hearing process with multiple stages. But in this case, these are projects that are fully compliant with underlying zoning. And this would be the kind of process that would be pursued for a free market project that was 100% compliant. In those cases, an administrative review for those kinds of projects would not have that notice until the end of the process either, until that approval had been granted. So it would bring parity to all kinds of projects that are compliant with the land use code as it currently is written. And so this wouldn't be sort of creating a special carve-out for affordable housing.
Right.
It's kind of bringing it in line with other projects that are also compliant with the land use code.
Well, thanks for that more detailed explanation. That really answers a lot for me and probably the public as well. Okay, on to the HPC side. I've kind of wondered whether, and this would be post-moratorium, but should there be affordable housing components put into the HPC code that they use to review projects at all? I don't know, and if there's anything there. I can see where Ward is going on this. I guess I was a little more your second bullet point thinking about it, that not having HPC in the historic district reviews, but if it was an actual historic structure, yes. So I was kind of thinking a middle path there. But I do think Ward makes good points. I could kind of go either way. But again, I was just wondering if should there be any update to the historic preservation guidelines to address affordable housing, which is becoming more predominant as a potential in historic structures.
That's something that we haven't contemplated, but we can certainly respond to with more consideration and begin some sort of process outside of the moratorium,
Yeah,
absolutely.
that's what I was thinking, outside of the moratorium. But if there was a little more guidance about how affordable housing projects should be treated on historic structures, I would, again, stick with a 2. But, I just see it as a little bit of different, needing some guidance in there. But I could go 2 or 3 on the bullet points. Thank you.
John?
This 100% affordable housing review process seems like common sense to me, so I fully support it. And I do agree with the points Ward brought up as well.
Couple questions. Previously, we've talked about 100% affordable by right, and so is there any distinction between what is described here in longer language and the by right term?
Not so different from the demolition criteria of being very objective. This would give administrative staff and ultimately the community development director to make sure that these projects are compliant, are kind of designed and compliant with the land use code. They're complex. They've got a lot of moving pieces to them. We got to make sure that they're compliant with what APSHA thinks is a viable product and meets their rules and regulations. And so we do think that there's a purpose to giving an administrative review to these things. And I think there's also sort of this path that's described in the draft code language as it is to allow projects that come in that might have an element that's not compliant with the land use code to kind of resubmit. And again, there's not an allotment system, so there's not a time constraint on this. I think those are different that way. But the idea here is that these projects are complex. They touch a lot of different parts of the land use code, and the administrative piece is not so much to sort of use staff discretion, but to simply take the time and have the process to review and analyze these projects in compliance with the land use code.
At risk of oversimplifying the answer, this would not be by right, because by right implies that you're going straight to building permit and that there is no planning level review. And to Ben's point, the sort of nature of these types of multifamily projects, the complexity around some of it, really necessitates planning to take a look at it and have a conversation about one or another design solution to make sure that if they are trying to seek this, be successful in this administrative path, they can make design changes if they need to, or they can move to a board review and sort of get the larger design objectives that they have achieved that way.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I can certainly understand the desire for that and that being a good balance of our goals. Are there so now we're sort of on parity with the free market residential development, single family, what have you. Are there situations currently, I don't know what our backlog is if we have one, but if you're simply just getting into the line, even with this new parity process, will there be 100% affordable projects who get in line but have to wait months, years before that process at the administrative level happens?
Right now, administrative processes are a matter of weeks rather than months.
Okay.
I think particularly for projects, if they provide the information that we need to kind of show compliance with these things, I think that's one kind of thing that can speed along the process. The other thing is we're really hoping with this development review committee that oftentimes we get projects that show up for building permit and they've got fundamental problems with them that preclude them from going down any further in the development path. And so the idea with the inclusion of the development review committee, we don't typically do that for other administrative review projects. They're typically for projects that are going to a board for a plan development or something like that are more complex. But we want to include that as a mechanism to try to facilitate a more efficient building review process.
Yeah. Okay.
A building permit review process.
That all makes sense, given everything you said. I think what you've proposed is the right choice and acceptable to me. What I would ask is if that ever changes, and with this process, there are 100% affordable projects waiting a significant amount of time, please let us know that, because at that time, I want the VIP entrance, right?
Yeah. And I do think, and I think we've said this a couple times during this process, I think a lot of this stuff on encouragement of affordable housing is setting the groundwork. And I think that there's going to be a need for a layering of incentives and subsidies over time that are going to provide the right incentive in this economic environment to get units actually produced.
Yeah.
So I think that this sets the kind of review path.
Yep.
And whether it's a sort of, a more expedited path for affordable housing or additional resources given or what, I think that those are all things that we can continue to talk about.
Okay, so thumbs up on that. Moving to the HPC piece, I'm trying to not get hung up with, this HPC has made or several, bless you, decisions that may have reduced outcomes. There's discretion there. A future HPC could make decisions that include more outcomes, right? And so, I think basing the forever policy on this makeup and a decision is probably not the best way to approach it. Is there any reason to think that a administrative or staff level review rather than a commission level review would have less discretion or care for the historical context that we're hoping to preserve?
The answer to that is sort of less about the capabilities of the administrative staff versus the HP commission itself, as it is about what is best practice nationally in managing a historic district and in managing historic resources. And from the federal level on down to the local level, when you are a certified local government, which the city of Aspen is for running a historic district, having a commission charged with the application of guidelines and the management of that district is best practice. And so in that way, and I'm channeling our HP staff to the best of my abilities right now, in that way, bringing projects in the district or which contain a resource, a historic resource, to the commission is sort of aligns with best practice and makes sure that we are right by our certified local government status to the letter of the law. I'm not suggesting anything staff's proposing in terms of the administrative path would get us away from that, because if there's a historic resource present, we would still be applying historic preservation guidelines to the management of that resource. But philosophically speaking, using the commission as it was intended to be used is best practice. But that said, if staff didn't feel like one of these three options was a viable or a defensible option, we wouldn't have put it on the table.
Yeah, and
That's
you're
why-
responding to the sort of the same set of expectations.
Correct, and we sort of found ourselves internally unable to reconcile adopted city policy with respect to historic preservation and the value that has for our community, with the clear council direction to create as smooth and as predictable a path for 100% affordable projects as possible. So that's why you're being asked the question.
And the level of discretion that is granted to the commission in terms of a range of project sizes, frankly, and possibly unit counts, does that range of discretion change in any way if this is reviewed administratively versus at the commission level?
I do think that let's call things out as they are. I think that the big topic is mass and scale, right? And so I think multifamily and sort of the mass and scale that's associated and the density, intensity that's associated with mass and scale is the thing that I think rubs up against HPC criteria. And so I think that, proposal number one that I think staff laid out is kind of keep status quo. If they're not, under HPC jurisdiction, we're going to, stick with, we'll go with the administrative review. HPC will still have jurisdiction and continue to work on things, I think, as Rachel suggested, of maybe some new design guidelines that sort of specifically address sort of AH projects would be a path to kind of maintain status quo and yet kind of work on acknowledging that maybe AH projects do have some fundamental rubs with, sitting behind a miner's cabin. And so I think that we're trying to, I think, navigate, I think what Philip just identified of, what are best practices. I think our HPC has, really served the community well over decades of keeping the integrity of the program and of our architectural and historic character, right? And so that's sort of in conflict to some degree with our desire to sort of alleviate some of the uncertainty around AH development. And so that's
But again, to recenter on the question, I think
Thank you.
the administrative staff are trained in applying historic preservation best practices and writing and applying historic preservation guidelines. And so in that way, we would not have put forward a proposal that could have led to a potential where using the purely administrative path would undermine historic preservation outcomes broadly for the community.
And it would not in any way change what could be put forward by the applicant to be considered, right? That's correct. I just want to understand that. Okay. This is a challenging one for me, honestly, because, I think the first question we're kind of wrestling with is, would this change in dynamic change the outcome in any way? And granted, every outcome, different people, there's some level of variability, but what I'm hearing is no. And so if there's not a change in in the outcome, then the question is, for the developer of that, how much time, which means cost, are we adding to an affordable project? And is that enough to keep an affordable project we want happening, from happening? And I guess I just don't know how much extension this creates, because I also hold as a very strong value the empowerment of local citizens on boards and commissions. And so if there's a small price to pay for that empowerment, then I would say keep the empowerment. But if it's significant enough to maybe affect the viability of a project, I would say we're going to get the same outcome. Let's do it at the administrative level. Can you help me with that at all? And maybe it's just a judgment call.
Philip, I'm gonna jump in there. I would argue that this is an administrative task of applying the code. those citizen boards had a very critical role in developing the code that is being administered. So I would not view this as minimizing their contributions in any way to the outcomes to the community. But this is taking, because there's no variances under this scenario here, it is truly taking what has been adopted and approved and implementing it. Thank you.
I appreciate that. I kind of want to hear what everyone else, I'm a little on the fence on this, surprisingly.
Well, you've heard from most, for me, I looked at option number 2, kind of respectful of the HPC purview in historic designations. But I get what you're saying, and I like the way you phrased it last, which was about if it's not imposing impediments, then leave it. If it is, then no.
Right.
Sarah clarified that by saying, like, hey, this is best administrative because the guidelines are clear here. So I'm a bit like you, Skippy, on this. I'm, in the memo recommendations, it was about option 2 and 3, and I'm in there somewhere. I'm anxious to see this moving forward. I don't know when we're going to get returns or see this in action.
What is 2 again? I know what 3 and 1 are, but define 2 for me.
It's allowing HPCs.
It's kind of differentiating a project that's in a historic district that's not designated from a designated property. So it would be a property, say, on Main Street, that was in the district but was not a designated property, didn't have a designated structure associated with it.
Yeah, got it. Okay, and wards in 3, 2, 3, question mark?
2.5.
2.5, 2.5, yeah.
My major concern with the purview of HPC is that we lose unit, that we have lost in the past units. And, I'm not asking that the guidelines not be followed. I want the integrity of the program to be maintained. I don't want to lose affordable housing because of an HPC purview or action. So that's what my major concern is. I don't like the setback variances or variations. I'm still not clear on what the difference between the 2 is.
Variance.
Yeah, the setbacks and, like a garage 2 feet off the alley. I don't like that. I think that those kind of decisions can be administratively done by you guys. You know what the building codes are, you know what the HBC codes are, and I don't want to have 2 people decide that we're going to lose an affordable housing unit, and that's what has happened.
Yeah, but it could still happen at the administrative level as well.
It could,
Yeah,
but it hasn't.
correct.
Because there hasn't,
And let's not go down this too far because, Ward has specific examples from his experience that he's drawing on and saying, hey, where the goals of HPC may differ a little bit from overall goals of affordable housing, but his concern is going forward for those not to be subjective. And as he's said as well, it's not necessarily about how the board operates. It's that there could be a time where that board is an anti-housing sentiment. So if they have purview over something, they could bring that to that decision making. I would say, on 1020 Cooper, while I didn't want to lose a unit there, I thought that the compromise that was reached in that was for the benefit of neighborhood, affordable housing, and the like. So now, I didn't like the example from a building in the core over here, but I don't have as much reservation about HPC's goals, but what I hear from Ward is he's concerned about it going forward.
Yeah,
So-
I'm leaning towards 3, but not for the reasons that
Right.
Ward put forth. I think that over time comes out in the wash, no matter who's reviewing it. And I appreciate, Sarah, that HPC still has the same stamp on the building, and so in some objective way, it doesn't change. But I think the felt sense of empowerment does change. If you're on that board and all of a sudden we say you're not going to review directly AH stuff, people are going to feel like something has been taken away from them in their review, and I'm just mindful of that.
I'm pretty confident that we have sufficient direction on
Okay.
sort of 2.5 to respond to. And I think we can come back with something thoughtful.
Very good.
Thank you. Okay, last kind of major policy discussion, and I think most of these ideas are familiar to you. This work is entirely proposed for the 26.710, which is the description of the zone districts. And it would do a combination of things, but ultimately it's about getting rid of some of the either intended or unintended obstacles that are in the land use code to affordable housing. Again, not by themselves going to have affordable housing units pop out of the ground, but serving as a foundation to get rid of the zoning obstacles to do so. And so one of the things is giving some additional density potential within our residential zone districts, allowing for either triplexes or fourplexes in the R6, in the R15, using the underlying dimensions in terms of height and floor area that are already allowed, but you could do more units than you're currently allowed in those zones. The second point is that we have some existing multifamily in the R6 and R15 that have potential for being converted to deed restricted, that are currently locked into their current configuration because they're a non-conforming use in that zone district. We've tried to resolve that. This is a topic that we had a conversation about, and there was a proposed code amendment from the private sector dealing with this topic. The difference here is that we're proposing it for 100% affordable multifamily projects, that those projects could be built on lot sizes that are less than the minimum stated lot size in the zone district. And it's really about this kind of technical interaction between some of the zone district standards and a term that we call non-conforming lots of record. It's kind of a technical change, but potentially impactful, particularly in the RMF. Across zone districts, both residential and commercial, making sure that we identify 100% affordable as an allowed use. In several zone districts, it was kind of ambiguous or not stated crystally clear, but we've gone through and tried to do that. We also had some language that kind of precluded the pursuit of affordable housing credits in commercial zone districts. We're proposing to kind of eliminate that. It's not necessarily changing the idea in our commercial zones that they're commercial zones first and foremost, but if somebody wanted to put a unit on a second or third floor, they could pursue affordable housing credits for that project. And then lastly, and this was an action in response directly to council direction, in the mixed-use zone district, the prohibition of the creation of new free market residential uses. This would be identical to the path that's been previously taken in the CC, C1, NC zones, and we would apply that same language to the mixed use. Existing existing free market would remain as conforming use, but new free market is a prohibited use, precluding kind of use changes in the mixed use.
What's the NC zone district?
Neighborhood commercial.
Not show business.
I couldn't find it.
It's city market
City market.
Yeah.
and the butcher's block.
Isn't it also the whole,
SCI?
It's a
oh, yeah, no, I was thinking of SCI.
transition zone
Yeah.
from commercial to neighborhood, basically. Okay, Skippy.
Question, is free market residential allowed in SCI?
It is not.
It is not, okay, so that's already good.
New free market is not.
Okay, just wanted to make sure we weren't missing that. I'm curious about the upzoning to tri or quadplexes as explicitly called out, as opposed to APCHA has already existing guidelines on, minimum sizes of units, circulation, common space, et cetera. So why not just say, if it's 100%, you get this box, do what you want with it?
I think it's a recognition of a couple things. One, I think it was kind of statements that we heard clearly from the community in our outreach that, you know, we like the idea of affordable housing everywhere, but it needs to be in the sort of character of the neighborhood. And I think looking around at other communities that have, you know, taken single-family zone districts and tried to grant additional opportunity for affordable housing in those places, a fourplex is, you know, it's a fairly big leap on a single lot from a single-family home to 4 units with 4 families and 4 parking spaces and all the activity that's going on. And so I think it's an acknowledgement of kind of that push and pull of those two things. And I will say that based on some of the analysis that Design Workshop did, you know, if we put 6 or 10 units on some of these R6 or R15 lots, even those numbers of units make projects pencil out for a developer, you know, by themselves. And so
They do or they do not?
they do not.
Right. So we're not getting a huge benefit in
Yeah,
that.
I think it's, oh, yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think with the analysis that we did, you would need to be looking at 16 or more units minimum, and then you're just kind of barely reaching a threshold. It's just that density that's needed with the current set of incentives and benefits for affordable housing, so creation of housing credits as an example, just doesn't move the needle enough at that lower density, and you just have to have so much density that it felt inconsistent with the community feedback that we heard as it relates to maintaining neighborhood character. And really that has to do with parking and how much parking would be required for a 10-plus unit complex, which just is out of scale with the West End and Cemetery Lane as an example.
And I will say that, you know, keep in mind that this would be by right. So, you know, you're doing what, you know, it's a by right thing. But if you wanted to do a project, as you described, that was more significant in any of these zone districts, we have the Affordable Housing Plan Development Overlay that you can go, it requires a rezoning process. It's a big public process. But there is that opportunity, you know, and maybe there's some lots out there in the R6 or R15 where, you know, there might be some opportunity for somebody to do a project like that. But there is a path for that, but it's a much more significant public process to do something like that.
Jessica, in your evaluation, I mean, was it really parking that stood out as the one thing, or is it's parking and also that's going to be a 5-story building?
Yeah, also that, right?
Seems like a bigger
Or-
impediment to me.
Or you are required to pack so many units subgrade that you wouldn't meet some of the code requirements related to where that net livable is located. It would be just a lot of subgrade units as opposed to having a mix of one unit being also above grade. And I think from the long history that the city has done affordable housing, it's really important that you're not just packing units in subgrade, because the quality of life is just not there.
I appreciate that. That's helpful. I mean, for me, that question of how to deliver this is sort of the holy grail that this is getting at, and we knew we were never going to get there, and there were going to be bars that none of us were willing to breach. So it's a 5-story building in the West End, like it's a non-starter. It will be helpful for me. I recognize these are all moving forward, right? And this is a good progress, but I don't want to spend 5 years getting to the promised land. It's going to be too late. So to better and more concisely understand, I know my people did it. It took 40 years. It wasn't great. It took a really long time. To better understand the sort of like, you know, the capital stack, not in the sense of where they're going to get their funds, but the variables that go into this. So there's the density allowed, there's the affordable housing mitigation you don't have to pay, there's the number of units you can convert, there's the FIL number, there's all these things that go into that equation, the density allowed. To really understand those layers would be helpful, because I'm here sitting like, should we be giving a 20% floor area bonus to these projects? Well, if it has a meaningful impact, then yeah, I think we can, and we can stand on those values. But if that's a rounding error in what they need to deliver that, why piss off a bunch of people when we're going to get these many more dollars? But I really want to see that clearly and concisely, so that one, we're getting ready for that next conversation, but so we're also starting to see that conversation with the community, because that's what's coming next. And we need to sort of pre-negotiate that, whether that's with ourselves and where our 150 funds go, or with the community and subsidies or future revenue streams and where they go. I'd like to find some way to really concisely illustrate that equation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that's anticipated work after the moratorium to dig in more deeply to some of those things, and what are the incentives that this laid the groundwork maybe, but what are the incentives to really start to see some fruition in the policy idea?
Right, and I appreciate that, and the timeline of delivery. What I'm saying is I want to see that, in some concise way before we approve this, because I want to justify to myself and the community why we're not pushing for more FAR here, because I recognize that looking at that, this will come later from another way.
We can get close to what, I think what you're describing, and I do want to reiterate something that Jessica said really, really articulately, which is this is responsive to the community feedback that we got roundly. And so the sort of the layering on of additional incentives through floor area or density would start to depart from that clear community feedback we received about, yes, an acknowledgement that affordable housing is important, not at the expense of scale and character.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I appreciate that. And I think that's clearly shared by all of us regardless. But to understand that, because the community has also been very clear about the need and want for affordable housing, the willingness to move it into additional areas. And so it's like, how do we achieve that, and what should we expect going forwards?
We didn't have any specific policy questions for council on this, but we've gotten some good feedback. On those specific items, any questions, comments? I heard some desire for some additional information. Anything else on this topic?
So one thing I'm wondering, which we've talked a little bit about before, and mitigation, is why do single-family homes mitigate at Category 2 and commercial at Category 4? And 2 sounds closer to appropriate for single-family homes. It's just that 4 doesn't sound appropriate for businesses. And so, again, that might be post-moratorium, but that's one I continue to want to bring up. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Any further here?
I just want to thank you guys. I mean, just really deep work, and I think you're just talking about it in this point, but we've really listened to the community. There's a number of things that we went into and we altered because of feedback from the community, and either us saying, hey, we hear you, we'll accept that even if we'd rather not, but more often, oh wow, that's a really great point we hadn't thought of, or thank you for helping us develop this idea. And so it really does feel like that co-creative process, and I very much appreciate that from staff.
Thanks, Tippy. John, any comments here?
Just the fact I think you guys are doing a great job, and this has been difficult, but we're heading in the right direction. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Is this the end of your items?
I've got 2 more slides,
Okay.
maybe 3.
Okay.
So
33% increase.
I just wanted to say that on top of, when you see draft code language in front of you in a couple weeks, there's going to be several other sections of the land use code that are touched in support of those larger policy objectives. These are in these sections of code, they're relatively simple to kind of just facilitate the things that we talked about previously. But I did want to give particular attention to these 2, which again are in support, but they're a little bit more substantial. Calculations and measurements. The first thing that we've done as we've thought about including subgrade areas and getting rid of the credit for existing floor area, we did have to do some work to definitions around floor area. So there's some work there done to bring clarity to that. Garrett has been really working on talking with the industry and talking with our internal folks, our zoning folks, to try to give flexibility for existing homes that don't want to demolish, that want to upgrade their energy performance standards, either in terms of insulation or mechanical equipment. And this is going to require some flexibility in our setbacks and our height to allow people to add another layer of insulation or to sort of upgrade their mechanical equipment, either located on roofs or sort of in a setback. So there's a proposal around that. And then because of the significance of demolition, demolition used to be just a couple of paragraphs within our miscellaneous and calculations section. We're now creating a whole new section of the land use code. We're giving additional clarity to calculation processes related to demolition. And importantly, this is going to be the location of the adoption and discussion of the residential demolition and redevelopment standards that we've previously talked about, and the kind of describing the process that would bring any changes of that document back to you folks, but short of a full code amendment, because it'd be living outside of the land use code. So if we did make changes to that document over time, it would come back to you in for a resolution as probably an action item to discuss any of those changes, but the discussion of that process lives in this demolition section. So with that, see, I promised just 3 slides. Happy, we've gotten a lot of good feedback from you. You certainly answered our specific questions that we asked of you. We've gotten some, requests for some additional information at first reading. And then just wanted to kind of remind folks of kind of our schedule moving forward. With that, I'm done, but happy to answer any further comments from you. And it sounds like Phil might want to say some things.
Thanks, and just briefly on process, again, the dates are up there. From a sort of philosophical standpoint, where we believe we're getting to is a really high level of understanding and direction from council on all these topics. And as we get into first reading, and particularly second reading, we're running out of runway, so to speak, with respect to the July 8th deadline we have for the adoption of ordinances and the 30-day effective period.
August 8th?
Well, August 8th is the end of the moratorium. July 8th is the beginning of the 30-day effective period for ordinances.
Okay.
And so with that sort of runway terminus in mind, if we get into first reading and particularly second reading, and there are particular elements of staff's proposals that council does not have a majority of support for, we will be in a position to have to peel those off of the ordinance, as opposed to doing additional analysis, potentially scheduling special meetings, or even taking more drastic action than that. Staff's recommendation at this point is that we would simply peel items of non-agreement off of the ordinance so that we can get to second reading and get to conclusion of the process. And I just wanted to telegraph that for council ahead of time as sort of staff's default sort of approach to getting to the end of the process.
Sounds good.
A couple other ways to say that, but yeah. Get it together. Thank you for that very much. Fred, I just wanted to, you're here, you've spent a lot of time with us. I want to give you an opportunity if there was any comments on the last 2 items that you didn't comment on, but.
I appreciate your letting me speak and taking the time, and I appreciate letting me be here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
With that, we'll call it a meeting. Thank you guys very much. As I look at you guys, I'm sad for other communities that don't have. Just great work. When we took this bite of the elephant, over 6 months ago or whatever it was, 5 months ago, it was daunting, and you guys have done such a great job of making it digestible and bringing us back really everything that we've been asking for. And I am really encouraged by tonight's presentation. I think the work that we're doing is for the better of our community, and I think our community recognizes that as well. So but thank you guys. You've really done all this work, and you've kept a smile on your face, and it's really appreciated from this table, so thank you.
Yeah. Ditto, ditto, ditto.
And with that, thank you, GrassRoots, and we are back tomorrow for a regularly scheduled meeting, which starts at 5 o'clock, so we invite any public comment at 5 p.m. tomorrow. Thank you. Skippy.
Tori/Sarah, I have a question for both of you.